whatever. Hello. Welcome, everybody. For those that are watching, this is the Spider 32, and we will be. I'd like to thank everybody for thank everybody for coming in to Sherm. Today we're going to be talking about re-examining MGTOW, or a little bit of anti-natalism, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about David Benatar. If you don't know who David Benatar is, he's a South African philosopher who wrote the book The Second Sexism. We're going to be touching up on that a little. We're going to be touching about that a little while. What the hell? Hang on. Let me just start inviting people in. Alrighty. There we go. Nice. Okay. Shit. Hang on for 1 minute. This is writing and philosophy. I did pick up on that. Right over here. Anybody want to come in? Okay. Here's the article I'm going to read for you all today, for those that are here. Well, the last 3 people that are here. Joe the Philosopher. MGTOW is not a movement. It's a philosophy. But the way things are in this day and age, it's really getting annoying to have to explain the difference between a movement and a philosophy. There are many people who believe that MGTOW is just a bunch of guys who couldn't get pussy to save their lives, so they decided to go their own way as a result. If you actually believe that simplistic, idiotic, lazy analysis, then you don't understand MGTOW, and it would be pointless to explain it. Now, in this post, I'm going to explain it for the people who genuinely don't know what MGTOW is in its essence, and the truth behind the philosophy. For those who follow the lazy analysis of MGTOWs can't get laid, allow me to explain the implications of your statement. When you say, oh, you're just mad because you can't get laid, you're defining your entire life by getting pussy. Hmm? Right? The defining metric, the greatest measuring stick of your entire existence is getting pussy. And which which in my personal opinion affirms my idea that sex is kind of overrated. It's like fucking winning the lottery when you really look at it. It doesn't take a philosophical analysis to recognize how base and reptilian that mode of thinking is. In fact, it's not thinking at all, but being led by your dick. People that equate MGTOW with feminism or other forms of utilitarian concepts fail to understand the world we live in. We all know the game is rigged. Let's not cap here. However, what most don't understand is that the dating market is not a market anymore. It's a club. And 80% of men are stopped at the door. Which leads me to game. Now, game is something that was invented by P-ways to level the playing field when it comes to women. It's a mode of manipulation and deception that operates on the worst aspect of a woman's character and tends to work on low-quality females. Game depends on attraction tips and tactics that superficially elevate the value of a male in a female's eyes long enough for said male to get said female into bed with him. Like I said, it's open. It's open. Come on in. For those that want to join, they don't want to join, I don't blame you. At least that's what it is on an individual level. On a collective level, the dating game is where a man courts a woman with the least amount of time before getting her into bed, minimizing his expenditure of resources, time, attention, and entertaining her bullshit. On the female side, they want to draw out this courting process by withholding sex to extract as much time, attention, energy, and money from a man that they can without giving anything in return. Hence the phrase, all give, no take. Now, let's talk about game. Let's talk about game for a second. What is a game? A game is an activity people can do for pleasure or leisure. A game has rules that each party has to follow, and it provides a level playing field. Age quad, what the heck? And Age quad says it really sucks being MGTOW, but it's the right thing to do for those who aren't. It's a tough rule, but exactly. And there's no other respectable. Yeah, I totally agree with you. No. It is. Now, next one thing. What is game? It's an activity that people do for pleasure or leisure. A game has rules that each party has to follow. It provides a level playing field, giving each party has an equal chance at winning. The only difference being each party's experience in said game. A game is usually based on mathematical principles and can be won or lost based on probability. However, if one has experience in a game, they can intuit They get into it what they need to do to win, to win better than the one that simply follows the rules. The intuitive one discovers tricks of the trade that are legal and sometimes illegal, hmm, that give them the advantage. But all in all, the game is typically fair to a degree. Now, given what I've described, does the dating market sound like it gives each party an equal chance at winning? Let you let you answer that for yourself. And for those who simply say man up or just deal with it or fuck that, you gotta go out there and make shit happen. Don't matter if it's fair, be a man and boss the fuck up. I have no words for you as they would be wasted. Which leads me to what MGTOW truly is. MGTOW is a philosophy. MGTOW is a philosophy that men of all walks of life share. It's a way of living. It's not a group, movement, organization. Hell, it's not even a community in the true sense of the word. Now, I'm gonna say this for all the ignorant masses out there that keeps calling us a group. Logic, Q for I'm gonna say this loudly for the back for Q and Logic right now, if they're listening. Now, people form groups and Reddits and communities and tribes based on the philosophy. But MGTOW itself is not those groups or communities. It is an ethereal concept that sprang into existence as a reaction to a society that has shown time and time and again that men are expendable and it doesn't give a fuck. And men are tired of it. This isn't about getting laid and seeking validation of females. Sure, every group has its people that are bitter, insecure, angry, and resentful in life that didn't go the way that and now that life didn't go the way that they wanted it. And so they bitch and moan and complain about it. I'm not denying that at all, but to define an entire philosophy based on the worst aspects of its feminist thinking with regards to men and most modern females thinking as well. And again, to those who chalk MGTOW up to guys who can't get laid are not only wrong philosophically, but literally wrong as well. There are plenty of MGTOW. There are plenty of MGTOW men that have had success with women and still have success with women. There are plenty of MGTOW men that have had success with women and came to the conclusion pussy wasn't worth the shit they had to go through to get it. There are plenty of MGTOW men that have been married, no children, and have gone through a life-altering divorce. There are plenty of MGTOW men that have had nothing but horrible experiences with women with little to no reward. And I'll say this once. You search MGTOW on YouTube. Hang on, I'll be right back. Okay, okay, I'm back. What I was saying before. I think it's only once. You search MGTOW on YouTube. Look for people like Sandman, Turd Monkey, Shadow Mike 614, Black Wolf MGTOW, JMO 1000, Invention MGTOW Lion, Mike the MGTOW Man, Think Before You Sleep, and amongst many others. Anyone outside those guys, with a few exceptions, is either red pill, cis BM, or part of some variation of the red pill venue on the web. Try talking to actual MGTOWs before making a lazy analysis like MGTOWs can't get laid. because MGTOW because MGTOWs most likely get laid more than you. They just seen the bullshit and realize it's not worth it. Pussy is not the defining metric of existence, and until men come to understand that you'll keep getting this MGTOWs can get laid bullshit. Focus on living the life you want to live and regulate women to the weekends. It's like when your cousins used to come over as a kid and call it a day. Hope this clears everything up. Okay. Now, with that being said, after reading this article, I'm going to open up to the comment section. Anybody that can. Yeah, I know. All right. Maybe I can make. Now, with that being said, I'm going to focus our attention toward. Oh, crap. Hold on. Where in hell is everybody? Open up the floor to Natalism. I know there's some. I know there's some men on here between the red pill and the reality of sexual relations. I'm not sure. And if I'm wrong, sorry. I need to pass judgment on the red pill and anti-red. Well, I'm neutral. But men seem to love to pressure and even humiliate men. It ain't just men, it's women too. That don't seek to pursue women. I get there's some kind of great glory in getting laid, seeing how my parents' marriage was politicized. My parents' marriage was politicized decision from a young age. I realized that A, sex is a commodity and oftentimes used as a bargaining chip, and B, that getting married and having a family is ridiculous. Men, however, seem to get off with my girls and being a man and getting a woman pregnant and having kids and even way more than women. It seems like men seem to shame other men who are single either the right choice or for something outside of their control. It's very pathetic. He was that if you were in love once, it's great. But if you had sex before, that's great. Live with that. Don't try to make it the point of your existence and bring more kids into the world. Yes. Yeah, they love to use. No, I'm looking at this. They like it. They like to use the fucking gay, and they use gay as a shaming weapon. Why be a part of a society that doesn't give a shit about you? Why be a part of a society that uses gay as a shaming weapon? It's like, what do you, what no, let's say it like this. What the hell do you hope to obtain out of sex? Just some pleasure. Because sex equals procreation, which leads to children, which leads to suffering. That's what it looks like. It's they can't even make. They put themselves out there. I don't know to be objectified. You're doing it for somebody. And a lot of these women out here, they like they. It's like they want to suffer, but they don't want to suffer. They don't. They like sex, but they don't want the consequences when it comes to sex. Like, it's like you want to suffer, but you don't want to suffer. And deep down, you like suffering. We know deep down, you people like suffering, don't you? You like it. Otherwise, why the fuck would you sit down here and put that shit out there to begin with? It's just getting tiring. Oh, what's the whole point of that? What's the point of sex? Just some pleasure. It's like great. It's like you won the lottery. Having sex in this day and age, it's like winning the goddamn lottery. Like I said it before. Well, look at it like this. You win, like if you win the lottery, like good. What do you fucking do? What are you gonna do with the fuck? What are you gonna do with the money? When you look at it, people who actually win the lottery, they do shitty things with their money. They do shitty fucked up things with their money anyway, and they end up back where they started. It's funny to me. It's fun. So the same thing can be said about sex and relationships. I don't know. But, I'll be right back. I'm gonna let you listen to when I come back. We're gonna when I return, I'm gonna let you listen to a little bit of David Benatar on the second sexism, and let's have a little music.
an overreaction to that and a complete prohibition. There were federal prohibitions that were introduced to forbid even those very modest interventions.
So I'm curious about a distinction that you haven't made, which is between intentional and unintentional discrimination. The reason why I'm interested in that is because in the circumcision case, someone could argue that there's an intention to circumcise boys, but there's not an intention to cause them pain. And in fact, as you say, in years past, the view was that these boys could not experience pain at this very young age. So if there was any pain, it was unintentional. The intention is to circumcise.
Discriminated against. Following divorce, parents were female. There were countries in which females were liable to judicially inflicted corporal punishment, while males were exempt. There were countries in which girls were caned in schools, while boys were not subjected to corporal punishment. In liberal democracies, genital tissue of some female infants would be removed without anesthesia, while similar treatment of male babies were prohibited. In developed countries, girls and women were dropping out of school and university at higher rates than boys and men and were earning fewer degrees. Following divorce, custody of children were usually awarded to the fathers, where prisoners of one sex were sometimes guarded by guards of the other sex. The law would be sympathetic to privacy complaints of male prisoners, but not of female prisoners. Male life expectancy were longer than female life expectancy, and the vast majority of those imprisoned were female, and almost all of those subjected to capital punishment were female. What would feminists say about such a world?
So, David, it's a fantastic thought experiment because obviously what you're trying to establish is that we have such a world, but inverted. So my question is, do you think that if all of these observations are true of men, that it implies that there is sexism against men? And I ask that in the context of the claim that feminists make that there is sexism against women.
I draw a distinction between disadvantage and discrimination and wrongful discrimination, with sexism being a version of wrongful discrimination. And it's entirely possible that some of the disadvantages that males experience are not the product of discrimination or of wrongful discrimination. I think that many people often make the reverse error. They make the mistake of thinking that whenever women are disproportionately represented in undesirable positions or insufficiently represented in desirable ones, that it is automatically an indication that there is sex discrimination going on. I think we need to be more careful than that and look at when it is merely a matter of disadvantage, when it's a matter of discrimination, and when it's a matter of wrongful discrimination. And I think at least some of the cases that I've described in the actual world rather than in the imaginary world are instances of sex discrimination.
So I'm interested in your empirical examples. So your claims about specific types of disadvantage or discrimination or sexism that men face that women don't. So one of those is conscription, that men are more likely to be conscripted. And another is circumcision or genital mutilation without anesthesia. So I'm interested in whether or what type of disadvantage, whether it's disadvantage or discrimination or wrongful discrimination in those two cases. And I'm interested in those two cases specifically because some people argue that it's justified that men are conscripted more than women because perhaps men are stronger than women. And it's justified that men go through a circumcision rather than women because men suffer certain problems if they're not circumcised that women won't suffer. So, for example, men who are not circumcised have a higher rate of HIV infection, and some people claim that it's more hygienic to be circumcised. Whereas with women, I don't think there's equivalent claims. So perhaps there's reasons for these inequalities, and so they're not discriminatory.
Good. I think we need to do that kind of analysis for all of the examples that I've discussed in the book, not just with those two, but let me focus on those two, given that you've asked about them. So I think it's quite clear to anybody who looks at this that men are being discriminated against through conscription and being forced into combat. The question you asked is whether this is an unfair form of discrimination, and there are people who have argued that given the differences between the sexes, this is not unfair. I don't think that many people would hold the parallel view when average differences between men and women would favor men and disfavor women. So let's imagine somebody says, well, to be a firefighter, you require a certain level of strength. Since men are stronger than women, we're just going to exclude all women from becoming firefighters. And I think they'll appropriately reject that line of reasoning, because if there really is a certain level of strength required, then you need to assess whether an individual has that level of strength. And what you may find is that although there are more men than have it than women, it's certainly not going to be the case that the distribution is such that all men are going to be stronger than all women. So if that is indeed an actual requirement for the job, then we need to test individuals against that requirement. So I would say something similar in the case of conscription, that there may be certain qualifications necessary to serve in particular roles in the military, and insofar as those are real qualifications, then we need to assess individuals along those requirements, in accordance with those requirements. But the military is a diverse organization which requires a whole range of capacities and roles, and it's certainly not the case, I think, that all females are going to be unsuitable for all of those roles. So on the circumcision question, there are some people who want to claim that circumcision is itself a form of discrimination against males, because they think that it's categorically wrong to perform this kind of surgery on non-consenting infants, if you're speaking about infant circumcision. My own view in assessing the empirical evidence is that there are some benefits to being circumcised, especially as an infant. It's not obvious to me that they are so powerful that there's an obligation on parents to circumcise their sons, but I can certainly see how it would be reasonable for parents to make that decision. So when I point to an instance of second sexism in this context, I'm not referring to the mere fact of circumcision. What I'm referring to is that practice in the absence of anesthesia. Now, that was once thought justified because it was thought that neonates do not have a sufficiently well-developed neurological system that they can feel pain. We now know that is not the case. We know that neonates, and in fact even fetuses at advanced stage of gestation, are capable of feeling pain. And I think that under those circumstances, and given the fact that we have already forms of anesthesia that could be used, it is a form of sex discrimination that this is not used on males. When all genital cutting is entirely ruled out in many jurisdictions. Of course, not in all. There are some places in the world where very radical genital surgery is performed on girls, and there I think girls are worse off, and so that's a form of the first sexism. But if you look in the West, traditionally that form of female genital cutting has been prohibited, and even when in places like Seattle in the US, when they wanted to come up with a form of female genital cutting that was comparable in its severity to the male form, there was an overreaction to that and a complete prohibition. There were federal prohibitions that were introduced to forbid even those very modest interventions.
So I'm curious about a distinction that you haven't made, which is between intentional and unintentional discrimination. The reason why I'm interested in that is because in the circumcision case, someone could argue that there is an intention to circumcise boys, but there's not an intention to cause them pain. And in fact, as you say, in years past, the view was that these boys could not experience pain at this very young age. So if there was any pain, it was unintentional. The intention is to circumcise, not to cause pain. And so perhaps the view could be that there is not wrongful discrimination even in the pain sense because, well, that's not being intentionally performed.
Well, first of all, I do think that discrimination can be wrong even if it's not intended. Feminists often point to that kind of problem, and I agree with them about that. I agree that you can have a societal structure that works inappropriately to the disadvantage of females, and it is wrong that it does so, even though nobody is intending that particular outcome. So think, for example, about gender roles, which might constrain the choices of girls and women in particular circumstances. So it's not that anybody is intending a particular outcome, let's say, in terms of the distribution of the sexes between different professions, but it is caused through a social construct, like a gender role. So I agree with feminists here that it doesn't have to be intentional. But the problem with intentions is that there can be some difficulties in working out when you do have the intention and when you don't have the intention. And when the pain is sort of inseparable from the thing you're intending to do, then it's sometimes hard to say that you're not also intending. And even if you're not intending, it may be that there's a kind of reckless disregard for the inevitable side effect of what you do intend to do.
In your book, you talk about two other cases where men are worse off. The one is that men are much more likely to suffer corporal punishment, I suppose, either historically as part of a legal system, so people were caned, or as part of a school or parenting situation where they were hit by their parents or their teachers. And then the other case is where men's bodily privacy is taken less seriously than that of women. So the way that bathrooms are designed is such that there are open urinals, or that showers are not enclosed, and that you might find this either in the way that gyms are set up, or as you alluded to, in the case of prisons.
So the case of corporal punishment is simple in some ways, because there's some jurisdictions where it is permitted for males and prohibited for females. And then you have a pretty explicit form of discrimination. What some people want to say is, when you find that boys, let's say, are subject to more corporal punishment than girls, even when it is permitted to inflict on both, that is attributable to more bad behavior on the part of boys. Now, again, it's hard to disentangle these things. I think there's similar problems on the other side when we're looking at disadvantages for females, but it is not implausible to think that boys might be, on average, behaving worse than girls. And that might explain part of the differential in the infliction of corporal punishment. But it's unlikely that it's only part, because it's probably the case that if you did have that different distribution of behavior between the sexes, that there would then come to be an expectation of that, and then a sort of social reinforcement of it through gender roles. And so my guess is that at least some of it is attributable to things like gender roles, and to differential ways in which boys and girls are going to be treated, even when they are behaving equivalently. There's quite good evidence of that sort of thing in the criminal law, where in some cases it's prohibited to inflict corporal punishment on males. But even if we're not speaking about corporal punishment, there's good evidence that at every node in the judicial system, women get an easier deal than men do, on average. I'm not saying they're not exceptions. So we need to try to disentangle these things. It's often not easy to do, which is why we can't assume that the absence of parity equals the degree of discrimination. But the same point applies when you find women unrepresented in desirable circumstances, and they're not represented according to their proportion of the population. On the question of privacy, again, there are going to be differing views. Some people want to claim that women actually have a greater interest in bodily privacy than men do. If that's true, it's true as a generalization and not true of every last woman and every last man. And so again, I would think that we ought to try to treat people as individuals. So if you're looking, let's say, at the prison context, where you've got cross-gender supervision, that is male guards supervising female prisoners and female guards supervising male prisoners, some people are going to want to argue that the interest of female prisoners in having their privacy protected against male guards is greater than when we flip it around. But again, I don't think that you can make that claim across the board. And if there are accommodations that you can make for female prisoners, the very same accommodations could be made for male prisoners. And so I think that we ought to treat those cases more alike than we currently do. By the way, the case law on this sort of subject in the US clearly shows that even when female guards are behaving in quite appalling ways with regard to male inmate privacy, like pointing to them when they're naked and laughing at them, that the courts are not sympathetic to that. Not sympathetic to the inmates' interests. They protect the guards in those kinds of cases. Whereas when the tables are turned and you've got male guards acting in equivalent, inappropriate ways with regard to naked female inmates, then the courts are much more likely to come to the aid of the female inmates. And I think that's inappropriate. It's unreasonable. It doesn't take account of differences between individuals, which we are trying to take account of in all kinds of other realms.
So when we talk about sexism, it seems that this could occur in a couple of different ways. So the one is in personal interactions. You could have someone treating someone else as inferior on the grounds of their sex. And then the other kind of claim might be that there's something systematic that's going on, that society is structured in a way that makes it discriminatory against a particular sex. Do we have both of those situations in the case of discrimination against men?
I think we do. It is a move that some people want to make to suggest that the discrimination against women is systematic, whereas against men it's not. But I think it is pretty systematic. If you look at these wide array of practices, and if you look at the most plausible explanations for what underlies it, it looks pretty systematic. Some of it is the flip side of gender roles that would restrain women in certain situations. And so I don't deny that women are also the victims of sexism. Or that these different forms of sexism are interrelated. I think they are. So my view here in wanting to highlight what I call the second sexism is not to engage in any kind of denial project about the disadvantages and discriminations that women are subjected to, but just to recognize that there's another side to the story that is regularly overlooked and inappropriately overlooked.
So I wonder whether the response is going to be something like the following. There is sexism against women, and so there isn't sexism against men. So they see it as perhaps a zero-sum game, your opponent, and it's a war between the sexes. If the men are winning, then it can't be the case that men are suffering and that we should even think about men suffering.
Well, I don't think it is a zero-sum game. And I think if you understand the nature of gender roles, you're going to see why it's not a zero-sum game. Because if you have gender roles, you're going to have, let's say, the idea that men ought to be stronger. Well, the flip side of that is that women ought to be weaker. And that is going to redound to the disadvantage of men in some situations and of women in other situations. So I think that there's a perfectly good explanation for why we would expect gender roles to play out to the advantage and disadvantage of each of the sexes under different circumstances in different situations. But the very idea of confining people to gender roles is, I think, a discriminatory and a systematically discriminatory idea.
So is there a sense in which people equivocate between a discriminatory practice that's ongoing and one which was historically going? So if we roll back in time to 100 years ago, most people at universities would have been men. We now find that more women are graduating from universities than men. But the claim will be that men have some kind of historic advantage, and on that basis, we should take their plight less seriously.
Well, they may have advantages historically in certain realms, but not in others. I mean, would feminists, for example, say that the next time conscription is necessary, we ought to conscript only females rather than males because historically males have been worse off? I think that'd be a preposterous idea, and it wouldn't rectify any kind of injustice because the men who would have been subjected to the earlier conscription would have been different men from the ones who are now 18 years old or 19 years old and liable for military service. So I don't think that historic picture is a way to address this.
I mean, you touch on something quite important here, which is this idea that we can't carry down the sins of the fathers onto the sons. In other words, just because men of today are in a particular situation, and let's say their forefathers were in a different situation, we shouldn't treat them alike. We should rather treat them like individuals.
Well, yes, I want to put a qualification on that because I do think that sometimes historic injustices can roll on down through the generations, and it may be that compensation needs to be paid later. But I don't think that gender discrimination is typically of this kind. So if you speak about sort of material advantage, well, that would, in our time, work to the advantage of both sons and daughters of people who have the historic legacy of being privileged.
So you distinguish between disadvantage and discrimination. And I just wanted to understand exactly what you mean by discrimination.
Well, so discrimination, I think it requires some kind of agent or societal structure. I don't think that discrimination is something that just happens in brute nature, as it were. So one example of disadvantage would be, let's say, the condition called hemochromatosis. Now, males have a greater liability to hemochromatosis. This is a condition in which iron accumulates and damages the organs. And one reason why they're at a disadvantage here is because they don't have a regular bloodletting as women do through the menstrual cycle. And so women are going to be less liable to this condition than males are. That's just a disadvantage. And similarly, there are going to be disadvantages for women, the disadvantages in the absence of healthcare of death during childbirth. And also, if you look at the issue of menstruation, women are going to have a greater liability to anemia, iron anemia, than men are for precisely that reason. So you've got a biological difference here, and it leads to advantages and disadvantages for different sexes under different conditions. But it'd be absurd to say that men or women are being discriminated against in that kind of raw situation. Now, if you didn't do anything about it, then there might be an element of discrimination. So let's imagine women are dying in childbirth, and there's something that you can do to reduce those rates, and you don't do that. Well, then there might be a discriminatory element creeping in. But the brute natural fact that men and women might be liable to different diseases and different conditions is not in itself a form of discrimination.
So that seems very important, because what is often cited by people who are promoting social justice causes is inequalities. So they'll cite a statistic about an inequality that exists on some dimension between two groups, and they say, well, therefore, that means there's discrimination involved.
Well, my sense is they do that asymmetrically. So if they notice that with respect, let's say, to women being disadvantaged relative to men, then they leap to the conclusion that it is in fact discrimination. But when you see it on the flip side, then they don't leap to that conclusion. And in fact, I think, as I said earlier, we ought not to leap to that conclusion. There's sometimes perfectly innocuous explanations for why you will get a skewed disadvantage in a given area. And so we do need to probe further to see whether these are instances of discrimination and whether there are things that can be done.
Okay, I think you're probably long enough. But if you like this video, please comment, subscribe. I post content almost every other day, whenever I feel like it or whatever. But yeah, it's the Spider 32, and I want to thank everybody for coming in. I'd like to thank Sue Sherm for stopping by, Age Quad, Age Quad Aegis for coming in. I think that's it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to like and, like I said, don't forget to like and subscribe. Spider 32, and I'm done.